we find a number of facets. The first is that we recall, we bring to mind particular aspects of experience. That's the mindfulness part. And the Pali word for mindfulness is sati. Then we make ourselves fully aware of what we've brought to mind. And the Pali word for awareness is sampajanya. But we're not just aware of what we've brought to mind, we also contemplate the themes that we've become aware of. And the Pali word for contemplation is anupassana. And riding in the background of all of this is also what's called ardency, which is the healthy desire that something good happen as a result of our efforts. The Pali word for ardency is atapi. Now, all of these ideas, all of these factors are laid out in the introduction to the discourse, and they're applied to each of these four themes, these four foundations of mindfulness. The first three themes of mindfulness are the body, pleasure and pain, and the third Satipatthana is mind. Kaya, Vedana, and Chitta are the respective Pali words. And the fourth Satipatthana are basically a collection of various teachings that we find elsewhere in the texts. The Pali word for this fourth foundation is Dhammas. So in the last class, we started the contemplation of the third Satipatthana, Chitta, or mind. And as was said, Chitta is a pretty broad term in Pali. It covers a lot of ground, you might say. It covers our thinking life. It also covers our emotional life, the mind and heart, as you might say, the intellect and the heart. So what happens is we bring to mind the state of our mind, and rather than being caught within and controlled by our mind states, with sampajanya, we clearly comprehend our internal environment. Right? It's like we ask in this practice, what's the weather like in here? And with that clear awareness provided by sampajanya, we gain a measure of independence. But whether these weather systems, these weather systems, it's important to realize, I think, is that they're not just happening. They're something that we're making. As the first verse of the Dhammapada says, all experience is preceded by the mind, led by the mind, made by the mind. Right? All experience is made by the mind. So I like to think of this as Buddhism's creation story, right? In that in any given moment, we create the experience that we're having, right? Again, it's not something that's just happening. Even when stuff is coming up and it's stuff that we didn't know was there, or that it's stuff that we'd really not rather have come up, it is something that we're concocting, we're cobbling together, something we're fabricating. And with this teaching on mindfulness, the Buddha is saying that we can clue in to what the mind is creating, right? And with ardency, guide the mind in a direction that helps us, rather than being dragged around by our mental creations. This teaching, you might think of it as allowing us to remain, upright in the saddle, with our hands on the reins, rather than being dragged around by a horse, because our, foot is caught in the stirrup. And you may have noticed that we toggle back and forth pretty quickly between these two states. We get identified with experience in one instance, caught within an experience, but then we can snap out of it in an instant too. In this teaching on the third foundation, the third application of mindfulness, In the last class, we went through the 8 pairs that were in the discourse. 16 states of mind that Buddha laid out and recommended that we notice. And he recommended that we notice whether these pairs of mind states are present and also whether they are absent. So, for example, that this is the list. We can check out for ourselves. Is attraction present, or are we free of it? Is aversion present, or are we free of it? Confusion present, or are we free of it? Is there restlessness or contraction? Is the mind enlarged or not? Surpassed or not? Concentrated or not? Released or not? And so those are the 16 pairs. What we have here in the first half is an outline of states that most of us find troubling to be with, difficult to be with. And in the second half, we find what you might call the higher states of mind. And the goal is to familiarize ourselves with this mental terrain. Name what's happening, name what the mind is creating. In this way, the teaching is having us set up, and account for what's here. And we can also, interestingly, again, account for what's not bothering us. Positively engage in what is not bothering us. Similar to taking a moment to realize, I don't have a headache. Or I don't have a toothache, or I don't have a stomach ache, or whatever it is. So we can, for example, become aware for ourselves that in these moments I am free of attraction. And it's the analogy of realizing that the sky is clear rather than the sky is cloudy. And what we can do is keep that in mind, letting the freedom of being free of attraction or anger or whatever it is, let that take root. Just as attraction might take root, if we consciously or unconsciously cultivate it. Now, before we get into the new material for this morning, I thought we might take a few moments to practice. And I wanted to offer some instructions to experiment with. So to begin, if you want to adjust your posture in any way, something that you can be comfortable in for about 10 or 15 minutes, that would be great. So pay attention to the position of your legs, your hips, your back, your head. Come into a posture that's stable and upright. Let your eyes close if you like, if that's comfortable for you. And then maybe take a few deep in and out breaths, breathing deep into the belly, breathing out and relaxing. Breathing in deeply, feeling the body. Breathing out and relaxing the body. Now, instead of what might be the normal position for your hands, I want to ask you to place your right hand into your left hand. And make your right hand into a bit of a ball. And your left hand into kind of a cup. Let your left hand be as relaxed as possible. And your right hand Actually tighten it into a fist. Not a tight grip, but just enough to create a bit of tension. Left hand to cup, right hand to ball, right hand just a little tense. Now notice the difference between your two hands. The tightness in the right hand, container-like quality in the left. Now notice if the right hand wants to relax. And if it does, then let it. Whatever tension there was in the right hand, see if it can be released. The right hand still remaining in the shape of a ball, but it's relaxed. And the left hand being a container for the right. Now, for the rest of our meditation, 10 minutes or so, I invite you to explore the similarities between your mind states and your hands. The right hand being any kind of tension that might arise in the mind, or the mind being relaxed. And the left hand being like the greater awareness, the clear awareness that can know if another part of the mind is tense, or if another part of the mind is relaxed. So for this period of time, again, this 10 minutes or so, be clear for yourself. Is there any tension in the mind? Is there any tension that comes from attraction or aversion or confusion? Is there any tension from the mind being restless, unsettled? Or you might be clear for yourself that the mind is relaxed, open, clear, collected. So, whatever state your mind is in, there can be another part of the mind that can be clear about that. Be clear in these moments. mind might get entranced inside thought forms. If that happens, just wake up out of that as quickly as you can. Again, just be clear. Return to clarity. What is the mind like? Is there any tension in the mind right now? Or is the mind relaxed, released? In these moments, be clear about what the mind is doing, rather than caught inside what the mind is doing. Be clear. Is there any tension, any disturbance in the mind? And might that tension be relaxed? Is that possible? Now, I don't know if that is an effective set of instructions for people, but just so you know, the basic intent was to point to how one part of the mind can be a particular way, having gotten itself into a certain, maybe uncomfortable state, or, it's relaxed. And one way or the other, whichever way it is, there's this additional aspect of the mind that can be clear about it. Right? It's what we talked about before as being sampajanya, clear comprehension, clear awareness. Anyway, that was the idea. Point that out with that little exercise. Anybody have questions or comments about that? Yes, Emily.
My mind was chattering a lot, and it was really valuable for me to notice. First of all, I've had the aversion, like I've got spiders all over my windows. And second, I need lemongrass because I don't like lemongrass. And it was this continual, I would come back to concentration or trying to concentrate. I didn't use my breath, which usually brings me back. I was listening and wanted to see the different states I'd get into. I don't know that that was the point of the exercise, but that's what I did with it today. I saw the attraction, I saw the aversion and the restlessness. So I noticed the discomfort in my mind. You're valuable, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, there's the discomfort in general, but then, that discomfort has these different flavors that we talk about. There's the flavor of the craving, the flavor of the aversion, the disturbance that comes from being confused and restless, but just the idea that there can be a part that is apart from that and not caught within. Anybody else? Okay, well, let's move on then to today's portion of the teaching. So we're going to focus in today's class on what's usually referred to as the refrain within the sutta, Satipatthana, which is basically a list, another set of lists of 7 variations of mindfulness. Now, we encountered the refrain, these 7 variations, after each of the 6 sections on the body that we've covered before. We covered them in the section on Vedana, the basic experiences of the basic way in which experience can be pleasant or unpleasant. And we're going to now see how the refrain is applied to the mind. And so I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to read the refrain as it occurs after the section on the mind. And you can find this in the translation that I sent out in the email announcement too. And it goes like this. He remains focused internally on the mind in and of itself, or externally on the mind in and of itself, or both internally and externally on the mind in and of itself. Here's the second set. Or he remains focused on the phenomenon of origination with regard to the mind, on the phenomenon of passing away with regard to the mind, or on both the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regard to the mind. And then the seventh part is for his mindfulness that there is a mind is maintained to the extent of bare knowledge and remembrance. And then at the end, there's this piece on what you might call as being the fruit of this practice. And it says, he remains independent, unsustained by, or not clinging to anything in the world. This is how a monastic remains focused on the mind in and of itself. So the refrain has been interpreted in a number of ways by different people over time. In my mind, the most straightforward and fruitful way to interpret the refrain is this way. First, we contemplate how these mind states are present internally, that is, within us, within ourselves. You know, it's this basic self-awareness that we cultivate in this practice. But then we also contemplate the mind externally. That is, we focus on what's happening within other people. And I think this is a way in which we empathize. You know, it's pointing towards basic empathy. The third is that we contemplate both. That is, that these mind states happen within everybody, you know, all of us. I think this goes on to be an invitation to depersonalize mind states, you know, appreciate that they're universal. The middle section of the refrain, contemplating arising and passing away, they often get framed as being about impermanence. But it's actually more about cluing into what's called conditionality. That is, why things are happening the way they are happening. You know, we contemplate how things have come to be the way they are. Now, the seventh part is to bring what's called bare knowledge to the basic experience of having a mind. So that's the seventh part. So, kind of going into each one in a little more detail now. The very first part of the frame is what probably most of us are most used to, which is exploring, you know, internally, you know, exploring the stuff of our own mind. You may have heard the saying, you know, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and watch it. And that's basically, you know, what a lot of this practice is about. What can be interesting, though, is that some of us can carry some baggage with us, such that you know, paying attention to ourselves could be viewed as self-centered, right? You know, we get this message internally or externally that, you know, it's like the world is a mess and you're sitting here meditating. You know, how selfish is that? But in moments like that, I like to recall the Buddha's famous simile on the acrobats. And the message that we get with that teaching, the simile of the acrobats, is that we first take care of our own balance. We first take care of our own balance. You know, we take care of our own minds. And then that helps us to be safe. But by extension, maintaining our own balance also helps to keep others safe. In the simile, there were two acrobats, you know, one standing on the shoulders of the other. And there was a debate about whether, you know, each one should focus on their own balance or focus on the balance of the other in order to be safe and have the best outcome. The Buddha said, start with yourself, start with your own balance. And, you know, if you consider the flip side, you know, if we don't understand our own minds, you know, if we don't keep our own balance, as some of us probably know, it can lead to us being a real problem for ourselves. and again, by extension, being a real problem for people around us if we are unbalanced. So this practice of contemplating internally, it is about getting some clarity about what goes on inside of us, understanding our intentions, our motivations, and not letting them go underground and drive us unconsciously. But if this is our only form of practice, it could in fact accidentally lead to a kind of less than healthy self-absorption, right? So with the second and third parts of the refrain, the Buddha has us expand our sphere of concern so that the next thing we become mindful of is mind states that exist externally. That is, we bring to mind what's happening for other people. This exercise, this portion, it's not about mind reading, though, right? Instead, I like to think of this part of the refrain as pointing to this very basic thing that we humans can do, and that is to listen. We listen to each other. We watch and we try to understand what's going on for other people, within other people. The tricky part is that it's not always automatic. We're trying to listen to somebody, trying to understand, but our minds get clouded with our own judgments, right? Our minds get clouded with counter arguments. We veer off into our own agenda. We stay stuck in our own web of concerns instead of being open to other people's concerns, being open to what other people's truth is. So to be able to find our way out of our own internal thicket, you might call it, and really listen, it's a real skill. That being said, it's also really easy to get it wrong, misinterpret what's happening for somebody else. So it's good to stay humble and careful, about projecting our own stuff onto other people. But it is a very powerful and helpful intention, to carry with us when we interact with others. Another part of this is that it can relieve us of our own burdens, to consider the burdens of others. It can be a relief to open up and expand our sphere of consideration. For example, I was attending a talk given by another architect once, architect Michael Hickok. The subject of his talk was client relations. And at one point, he was describing how clients, like all of us, they can get angry and upset. Clients can go a bit wobbly, again, like all of us. But he said that when that happens, he said, remember, people just want to avoid anxiety. People get mad, right? But we're all just trying to relieve ourselves of suffering. So it was interesting. Here I was sitting with all these architects talking about professional practice. And then he said that, and it was like, my head spun, and all of a sudden I was in the Dharma hall. With those words, what he was doing is pointing out to how we can become mindful of the discomfort, the anxiety that underlies other people's mind states. And the point is that it can be a helpful shift to make, keeping in mind what's going on for somebody else rather than just what's going on internally. Getting outside of our own heads. It's important to note, too, that in being mindful of the states of mind of other people, the minds of other beings, we will become aware of mind states that aren't so good, that aren't so fun, right? And our habit may be to turn away from other people's anger, their fear, their grief, their delusion. We see somebody with an addiction or a mental illness, and it can be really hard to take in. Our first reaction may be, boy, I'm glad I'm not inside that person's head. But perhaps the follow-up to that is, the realization that person is having a really hard time. So that what might start as pity, can transition into compassion. Again, as we take into consideration the mind states of others. There's often a focus in this tradition on, our mind's pathologies, you might call them. But this practice of being mindful externally can also open up opportunities for happiness for us. So that, for example, when we're a little lacking in happiness ourselves, by being aware of and cluing into others' minds, we can tap into their happiness as a resource for ourselves. So to wrap up this part, just to say, when we work our way through this second set of the refrain, second part of the refrain, it can be interesting to think of the wide range of mind, the wide range of ways that the human mind can be. As it says in Samyutta Nikaya 22, verse 100, it says, "This mind is more elaborate, more diverse than the animal kingdom." Now, we can consider this, contemplate this, in our lives. We encounter a baby, and contemplate what goes on in the mind of this newborn. Or we see a toddler. What goes on in this mind of this mind of a toddler, or the mind of a teenager, the mind of another middle-aged adult or of an elder. And by the way, having a teenaged mind again is one reason I'd never want to be reincarnated. But kidding aside, given the great diversity of humanity, the great diversity of human minds, it is probably good to stay really humble about our ability to understand, somebody else. But again, just going back to the intention, there's a healthy intention to try to understand. The third part of the refrain is to abide contemplating mind states internally and externally. That is, we reflect on how these mind states happen for everyone, for all of us. Now, with this shift in perspective, we can perceive the impersonal, the universal nature of mind states. They're happening all around us all the time. This frees us up to not take our own mind states again so personally, and perhaps allow us to release what we might normally grasp at. Some of you may be familiar with the story, the Buddhist story called The Grieving Mother. In it, there's a woman, the mother, her name was Kisa Gotami. She lived at the time of the Buddha, and the story was that her infant child had died, and she had had trouble believing it. And so she was wandering around her village, carrying the child, asking people for medicine. And someone thought to ask her to go see the Buddha, which she did. So she asked the Buddha for help, and he asked her to uh, get some mustard seed. Get a mustard seed from a family in which no one had died. So as you can imagine, when she went from house to house, everybody, all the households had a mustard seed, but at the same time, everybody, all the households had experienced death. So after a while, she realized, after meeting with all these other people who had had these difficult things happen too, she realized, death is universal. So at that point, she took the child to the burial ground, and then returned to the Buddha and then told him about what she had experienced. The story goes that she eventually went on to become a nun and become fully enlightened. So this is a story, that I think is worth going into quite a bit. If we had more time, I think that'd be worthwhile. But just for now, to say that, point out that there's this process of realization going on in the story that's profound to reflect upon. This shift that can happen from, here I am in my grief to here we are in our grief. It really does describe one of the most profound, deep kinds of suffering that anybody can work with. But the realization can work at many other levels too. Just not just at the deepest. So, for example, one night recently, I woke at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and started to think about work. As I said, I'm an architect, and what had happened is I started to think about this list of questions that one of the contractors that I worked with had asked me about, how to build the building that I had designed. And I started to get anxious, wondering, how I was going to get the answers to these questions to him quickly, as quickly as possible. And I was, getting pretty anxious. It's the anxiety that comes from not being the one who gets things messed up. Right? That's the source of the anxiety. But instead of just being with the anxiety, right, being with the adrenaline burst, instead I thought to shift my attention. And instead, I started to think about how Bruce was anxious, the GC that I was working with. I thought about how Bruce was also anxious about getting the job built. And then I thought about how, in a way, we're both in this together, susceptible to the kind of stress that we are in our industry. And then I thought about all the members of the team that we're on. And how we're all just trying to negotiate our way through these urgent deadlines, juggling all of these balls and trying not to let anything hit the floor, so to speak. So because of this practice, I was able to transition to a kind of sympathy for the situation that we're all in, rather than staying stuck in anxiety about my own self-image. So I offer this as an example of how we can use, practice with the elements of the refrain, to gain a measure of independence in the mind that might not otherwise be there. The next section of the refrain is to contemplate the factors that lead to things arising, and contemplate the factors that lead to things passing away. And as I said, this part of the refrain almost always gets framed as being about contemplating impermanence. But it's actually more about appreciating, how it is that things come about, and how it is that things pass away. In support of that, I actually prefer Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the refrain over Thanisara Bhikkhu's, which is the one that I sent out. Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation goes like this: he abides contemplating the mind in its arising factors or its vanishing factors, or both. Right, so it's this word factor that I think is the key to hone in on. There are these factors that lead to arising. There are these factors that lead to vanishing. And actually, in Thanisara Bhikkhu's introduction, in the translation that I sent out, he actually makes this clear. He says about this part of the refrain, he says, it does not mean that one is focused simply on the arising of phenomena. Instead, it means being focused on how phenomena arise in connection with causes. So that being said, impermanence in Nietzsche, it really is part of the package. It's baked into conditionality. It's baked into causes and conditions. Arising and passing are an inherent aspect of our experience. And boy, isn't it clear that mind states are impermanent, right? Don't they arise and don't they pass? Don't mind states come and go? I used to like this, now I like that. I used to like you, now I don't. Right? I woke up feeling one way and now I feel another. It's just on and on. So we may understand change in impermanence at an intellectual level, but many of us in this practice probably know it's a different thing to actually have a direct experience of impermanence within ourselves, within our minds. We can see the mind percolate in real time, flow here and then flow there. We see that the mind isn't so much of a thing; it's a process. It's a series of actions, a collection of flickering events. Anger, for example, doesn't. It does turn on and off. Anger does turn on and off. It's impermanent in that way. But I think the more important thing that this part of the refrain is pointing out is how anger isn't so much a thing, that comes and goes. Anger is an action that we're taking, born out of habit. It's an expression of choices that we've made, intentions that we've created. So, for example, say I'm in the line at the grocery store, in line checking out. This can also be a time when the mind checks out as well. So within this sort of set of conditions, our mind is wandering. This is the scenario. Our mind is wandering. We're scanning the headlines of the tabloids. Perhaps we notice that chocolate bars are on sale. And then, we happen to see that the person in front of us is absorbed in their phone. And they're not putting their stuff on the conveyor belt. And I don't know if you're like me, you may start to think, get a move on, move it, let's keep this thing going. Right? We get irritated. Well, here's the deal, as the Buddhist tradition would point out to us. It may be our tendency to say that the cause of our irritation, the reason why we got irritated is the person on the phone. But according to the tradition, we could also, reframe this scenario such that, we're standing in that same checkout line. And this time, we've chosen to maintain within our mind the aspiration, may all beings be free of suffering. Right? And what that does is create a really different set of conditions within us. Right? The external conditions are the same, but our internal conditions are different from when our mind is wandering. We've created an alternative universe, you might say. And then when we see the person absorbed in their phone, maybe our response is a little bit of compassion, a little bit of tenderness, seeing somebody entranced, feeling bad that they're lost in distraction. We may even encounter a measure of humility, within ourselves, knowing that we at times get lost in distraction too. So you see that these two scenarios obviously have the same external component, but the important part is the set of conditions that we've set up within us, and that we carry around within us, such that when we encounter certain stimulus, in this case, someone being distracted by their phone, we can either become irritated or respond with some measure of composure and empathy. In either case, the resulting experience is not a given, right? The experience is something that we made. And that's how mind states come into being. We make them. Another interesting aspect of all this is that we can work backwards with this. We can discover that we're stuck in a certain frame of mind, and then we can ask ourselves, how did we get here? How is it that my mind state came to be this way? So this is an opportunity to what you might call reverse engineering the mind. We have these experiences that seem to arise out of nowhere, but we can take them apart and find out, what they're made of, how they came to be. I looked up reverse engineering, online recently, and I found one definition I found went like this. An object is deconstructed to reveal its designs. And this I found interesting. Sometimes the goal of reverse engineering can be the documentation of legacy systems. And I thought, wow, aren't we packed full of legacy systems, you might say, right? 3 billion years of life, trying to stay alive, and another 6 million years or so, of us hominids, dealing with what the brain scientists call, the 4 F's of the hypothalamus. You guys familiar with this? The 4 F's of the hypothalamus. They are food, fight, flight, and reproduction. So they come up for us, right? They're built into the system to a certain degree. So, so along those lines, the fear, the anger, the longing, the grief, that come up within us, in one sense, they are ours, but in another sense, they're not. They're part of our human legacy, right? They're a legacy system. We are experiencing them. They, on the one hand, they're not ours, but at the same time, they're not happening with anybody else, in that they are our experience. But we don't have to let that primordial karma have the last word. Right? That's one of the things that this tradition is pointing out to us. That our minds are plastic in nature. These things, even though they're old, there's still something we can work with and free ourselves from. So with that in mind, we can start to ask ourselves, these kinds of questions, in our practice. In formal practice or in just quiet moments of reflection, how did the state of longing, for example, come into being? Why am I anxious? What is it exactly that I'm anxious about? What am I worried is going to happen? These kind of questions, we can follow the trail of breadcrumbs, back and back and back. Another question might be, very timely one, why do I get so dang mad when I see that politician's face? Or, just very simple and common one, why am I so anxious about whether people like me or not? What's going on there, really? So to conclude, I would like to pan back out for a few moments and speak to the general nature of mindfulness, as it's portrayed in this sutta. First, just a little bit of history. Thanissaro Bhikkhu has this book he wrote called Right Mindfulness. And one of the things that he points out in it is that back in the late 1800s, there was this Pali translator. The translator's name was T.W. Rice David. And what he was trying to do was find an English translation for this Pali word sati. Right? And what he did was he actually used as inspiration a piece of an Anglican prayer that he was familiar with. And part of that prayer goes like this, make us ever mindful of the needs of others. Now, what the translator did was he made up the word, he made up the noun mindfulness, based on the adjective mindful. And apparently, in old English, mindful meant good memory, just as sati in Pali originally meant memory. So Rice David, he translated Pali or sati as mindfulness. And so what that did is match up with the intention reflected in the prayer, which was to remember, recall the needs of others. So what does this mean for a practice, our practice of mindfulness? What it means is that, it does mean that we're aware of stuff. We're aware of things. But the important thing is that in order to even be aware, we have to bring something to mind in the first place. Right? Awareness is awareness, and bringing something to mind, that's the mindfulness part. That's the difference between awareness and mindfulness. And in this early Buddhist practice of right mindfulness is laid out in the Satipatthana, we're proactive about what it is that we bring to mind. Awareness is happening all the time, so the very important question is, what are we bringing to mind and keeping in mind in order for us to become aware of it? Right? If you think of awareness as being like a flashlight, then the question is, where are we pointing the flashlight? And the sutta is basically an outline of where to point it. Okay. Well, those are all the thoughts that I wanted to offer this morning. I thank you for your attention. I hope this has been helpful, clear and not confusing, adding to clarity and not adding to confusion. But I'm open to that kind of feedback. So we have a good amount of time remaining for questions and comments. So I'd love to hear what you guys think.
I'll just talk. So thank you. This is excellent. Something occurred to me when you got to the part about both internally and externally, that that might include what happens between people. So being aware of our effect and how that can come back and affect us. Like if I'm angry, I can trigger anger in someone else. And then if they're angry, and it can kind of be bad. That's all.
Yeah, it can become a game of hot potato in a way.
The potato gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So maybe just mindful of like our relationship in that kind of field that can have a life of its own sometime.
Yes. Wow. Actually, in one of the verses of the Dhammapada, it has a little bit of an odd metaphor. It recommends that we become like a broken gong, which doesn't sound very inspiring. Why would we want to become like a broken gong? But the idea is that somebody can come at us with anger, for example, and instead of having our bell rung and we somebody strikes us and then we go gong instead, it's like there's no response. There's not a response of anger in return. Right? It's something that just gets absorbed without reverberating. But I think for most of us, we do reverberate. So Carolyn, I think that's another good thing to keep track of. And maybe something else to, reverse engineer, after the fact, because sometimes interactions happen so fast and we just get caught within them. We react out of habit, but it can be helpful to go back and unpack, what it is so that perhaps we can bring more awareness into a situation the next go around. Thank you. Yes, Alex.
Is that part of the analogy of the cupped hand and the fist? So that, like the gong that doesn't reverberate, the cupped hand feels the tension, but doesn't absorb any of that tension, which is like the awareness. So the cupped hand is our awareness.
Yes.
And the fist is the busyness of the mind, or what it's.
Yes, there's the cupped hand, but the fist could be a mind state that arises, like, oh, I realize I'm having a reaction. It could also be, I'm feeling something in my body. The hand could be, the fist could be a number of things, but So part of the practice is to identify, might be the best word, but to relate or to clue into more and more the clear awareness of what's happening, in addition to just what is going on in the mind and the body, not get caught within just this.
It's a great, I love the analogy. It's harder in the mind. The hands are too separate. They're identifiable as separate.
Yes.
And the mind is, at least mine, is a flowing thing without borders often. But that analogy is helpful.
But I think we could all realize we have the experience of knowing that we're having a thought rather than being caught inside of a thought. We can think and we can know that we're thinking.
Right, but there's a lot of tension. When you identify you're having a thought, then the tension of oh, I lost my focus, I can't relax here in this meditation. It's, for me, the observing part of me is not neutral. I can't depend on it as this neutral territory. It seems to be colored by many different things that are going on. Anyway, that's maybe just me, but that's why I find the hand analogy, it's beautiful, but at the same time, it's not as easy in there as it is.
Something to experiment with. Yeah. Yes, Ralph.
I really like the analogies, and it's like talking about reverse engineering, and here's the feedback bit. I find this very helpful because so much of when you read the original text, it can sound a little philosophical, a little abstract, especially since it's translated from long ago. It's analogies and having somebody discuss it and put it into practical terms, and things like the idea of reverse engineering my feelings. Something comes up, these ideas of internally, externally, originating, passing away, these aren't just philosophical things. You can stop in that moment and really stop and think about it. Where did this come from? What is going on? So it is an actual, it turns it from philosophy into practice. And that's what I find really helpful about these talks and about reading commentaries on the.
Yes, it's the basic difference between reading the menu and eating the food, right? Yeah. Or, reading sheet music and hearing the music. However you want to. I suffer from restlessness. Creative restlessness. My mind concocts very easily. Joe?
First, I wanted to thank you, Carl. This was really a marvelous class. I found so many aspects of what you shared in detail really helpful, and instantly brought to mind specific examples of things that fell right into the various factors you shared. And I wanted to share one thing that occurred for me this week and reflect on the choices that we can make, which we've been thinking about this morning. And I once a week, I send out an email with 6 positive links that might help people. It's called Mindful News. And I've received a number of really nice responses to what I've shared. My goal is to try to help nourish people in challenging and stressful times. And a few days ago, I got the first really negative email on this, and the woman disliked several links I had shared over the past month, and it really, with real bitterness and blame, and it was just really shockingly, intensely, desperately negative. And it hurt. And I thought, I thought, okay, how can I skillfully experience this? What are my options here? And so first I did some gentle, deep breathing like I would to relax into a meditation session. And I eventually stepped out the door and went for a walk. And I noted where I was feeling it in my body. And, I felt sort of almost nauseous. And I went along and I breathed and I looked at the green of the leaves and the color of the flowers and engaged kind of a little bit more with the world around me to begin to kind of be with the feelings that I was having. And then I started reflecting. So I'm seeing what's going on internally. Then I'm starting to engage with the outer world. And I start thinking about the world she's living in right now and how incredibly stressful it is for so many people, and how I'm clearly seeing an expression of this tremendous stress. And it's not personal. It's, what she needed to let out. And long story short, as the day went on, it came up perhaps a few more times, this just kind of almost ache of having this message sent to me. And then I started reflecting, what is behind my reaction to this? And I thought it was fear, because when I put this newsletter together, I wonder, are people going to like this link, or are they not going to like this link? Is it going to strike someone the wrong way, or will it be helpful? And I realized that's part of my creative kind of process. Fear is a little bit there. And here it had come back on me with great force. But as the time went on, I eventually was able to genuinely feel in my heart, almost like, send her love and wish her well and let her go, and know that she has to deal with her own suffering, but that my role can be to offer some love instead of, that resonating with her anger, or, I can offer some space and love around what had happened. Just want to share.
Yes, thank you.
Carl, can I share?
Yeah.
Such amazing teachings, and the sharing, and actually tying into what Carolyn said, but then also what Joe and Alex, the shift, the part of it internally, mind states internally and externally, and where you said shift, and then I just wrote, my notes were, here I am, there you are, and here we are. Mm-hmm. And so that that we're in this together, and with the fields that Carolyn mentioned, and then the simile of the acrobat, which I've never heard, and that's so powerful. But just that, the here I am, and not you and you're to blame and it's your fault, you created the imbalance, or in Joe's situation, that other woman, and with her anger and her sadness, and it's like, it's just, and here we are, and it's not, we just take responsibility for ourselves and not taking things personally. And it's so interesting how the metaphor, that of put your own, women we always talk about putting your own mask on first in the airplane, right? Putting your own mask on first. And how interesting that in this moment where we all are wearing masks and we're wearing our masks to keep each other safe, it's such a beautiful reminder every time we go out on the street. Thank you.
Yeah, Carl, are you seeing Alan's question in chat?
Yeah. Here, I'm reading that. Is everybody else able to see the yeah, so this is going to everybody. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so how to put this into practice? I think the answer that comes to mind right now is, pick a theme that you want to carry around with you in the day, and I think that's what the mindfulness practice really is about. It's not so much about just being aware of whatever happens to be happening. It's about what are we carrying in with us into any situation with us. So, for example, we may take on as practice, say in the next week, I'm going to focus on trying to clue into how it is for other people. How are other people doing? What are their mind states? I'm in the grocery store looking around, and of course there are the fruits and vegetables to look at. But how is the guy doing who's doing the stocking? Or how is the person walking ahead of me? How are they walking? There sometimes there's too much guesswork involved in that, and it's not useful. But whatever opportunities arise, take advantage of them. Or going back to the first theme of mindfulness, we could, there are all these exercises related to being within the body. We could just try to keep ourselves, keep the bodily activities in mind. As we make our way around in life, which has a really positive effect of keeping the mind from flying around as it might otherwise. Or again, we could keep in mind the phrase from that other architect, people just want to avoid anxiety, in any interaction. Keep that in mind as we're going into it. Keep it in mind for ourselves. So I think that's a long way of saying, pick an angle on it. Go into your day with a game plan, so to speak. I know in some ways, the idea of having an agenda gets a bad rap. But in a way, what this teaching does is gives us a variety of things to bring to a situation that help us. Pick something that's engaging. Something that you want to learn more about. Pick a situation that might typically be triggering, and say, well, I'm not going to just respond to that as it arises. I'm going to carry that around with me, or I'm going to address that all the time. So I'm going to get into the car and drive someplace, and I know I normally get irritated at other drivers. That maybe that's my habit. Well, so I put on the seatbelt, and then I'm going to say, may all beings be free of suffering, including me. Keep that in mind. as you're driving around. I know in my own experience, one time I was, I'm a bike commuter, and I was passing another biker who was coming down a hill really fast. But I had actually been engaging in a lot of metta practice at that time. And my first response was, wow, I hope you stay safe, dude. Whereas I really honestly knew that, on the other hand, my in a more mindless type of response, it would have been, you're crazy, man. You're out of your freaking mind. Don't do that. So you see the difference. It's taking something into situations with you. I hope that helps. That's the best answer I have at this point. Yeah, Ralph.
Adding to that, having your own agenda is also standing your own ground. I mean, if you're coming from a good place, but it's okay to stand your ground. I had an experience this week where a salesman was trying to rush my high-functioning autistic brother into, you got to make this purchase now, deadlines at the end of this month. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. And it's like, I step up, I'm going to take care of my brother. And I'm not going to let him rush me. Who's giving you these deadlines? Who's making these rules? It's okay if to remain calm in the face of somebody trying to push you along. It's like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not.
Yeah.
I don't care to join you in that space. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, it is about noon. I'm happy to stay on if there are other questions. Just to tell you though, next week we'll be getting into the fourth foundation of mindfulness. We'll start that. That's going to be first Saturday in September.